everybody, and welcome to A Course in Miracles Explained with me, Kenneth. Today I have a very special guest. You know, my guests are always special, that's what I always say. His name is Robert, or Bob. We're going to stick with Bob Rosenthal. Now, the guests on my show are always very multifaceted characters, and Bob is certainly one of those people. Bob is a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, and he has been a student of A Course in Miracles since a very, very early age. He was introduced to the course by Judy Scutch. And Bob is also on the board of the Foundation for Inner Peace, and he has been on the board on the FIP since 1992. And what is exciting is that Bob is going to be an author, or he has a new book called From Plagues to Miracles, which we will talk about later in this program. So without further ado, Bob, how's it going?
Good. Hey, Ken. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So Bob, just to kick off the show, would you like to give yourself introduce yourself, because people tell people, like, what is your background, how did you become to be involved in the work that you do with the FIP, and how did you come up with your idea for this book? And let's talk a little bit about the book after you.
Would you rather start with the book first, then?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay. Yeah. The book is kind of a work in progress that actually dates back as far as my involvement with the course, maybe even a little bit further. They both date to my earliest college years. The book, I had a course in college, my freshman year, a religious studies course with an irascible old English professor, an Englishman by the name of Theodore Gaster, who was an expert on just about everything in the world's religions. I mean, one of those guys who just could get up and without any notes just drop pearl after pearl after pearl. But his particular area of expertise, I mean, he'd written a couple of books on this, was Passover. And he had a take on Passover that looked at it as both a seasonal festival of renewal. The Nile River would flood, and that would, bring springtime, and with spring crops, and with crops, the reassurance that life would go on. Mm-hmm. But that was overlaid with a Jewish historical commemorative festival, and then with the deeper spiritual implications of that. And he interpreted all the various ritual foods. So he was the first one who kind of got me thinking, maybe there's more to this particular holiday than meets the eye. I took that with me. I was born Jewish, was bar mitzvahed. I took that with me into subsequent Seders, but not in a real, it certainly wasn't a calling or a passion at that point. Mm-hmm. I would say, the next thing on my path probably was A Course in Miracles. As fate would have it, my sophomore year roommate was Judy's son, and we quickly became best friends, partners in crime, etc. And at the time, I was very involved in the Seth material, the channel Seth. Judy was as well. We discovered that common interest. Her son had very little interest in any of that sort of, woo-woo spiritual stuff. And therefore, when Judy got introduced to the course, she let me know that she'd come on this, amazing work. And the next time I saw her, which was quite a number of months later, it was over Christmas of 1975, she introduced me to it. And at that point, it was still in the big black binders that Helen and Bill had material in. As well as in the earliest sort of Xerox of the binders in a paperback edition.
So cool. And you were in your 20s at this time. Yeah?
I was 20. Yes.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, looking back, it is amazing. So that's when the course entered my life, and I could talk quite a bit about that too.
Let's talk about Passover.
Okay.
Because a lot of people to me, I don't come from a Jewish background, and I did, like I told you before, I did go to Sunday school, so I know the story of Moses, and him parting the Red Sea. That's very famous, and manna from heaven and everything. But
the original
yes, exactly, the original miracle, isn't it? And now your book, your book is actually very multi-layered. And so let's talk a little bit about this first theme, which is the theme that overlays the entire book, which is the story of Exodus. Could you tell us a little bit about the story of Exodus and how it relates to the ACIM kind of view that you overlay onto it?
Well, having lived with these ideas about Passover for a long time, and I do go into this in the introduction in the book. At a certain point, I mean, I am a writer. I've written fiction. I've written screenplays. And in, I guess it was 1908, I mean, not 1908, 2008, maybe it was '08 too. In 2008, I found myself without any writing projects. We'd done a movie. It had sort of come crashing to a halt in post-production. That no longer seemed like a path forward. And I went to a Seder, the ritual Passover dinner that some friends hosted, and I shared some of my ideas about Passover that appear in the book, although at that point they were just, they were very inchoate. And everyone seemed to be like, wow, that's pretty cool. And my wife in particular said, why don't you write it up? And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. I've got nothing else going on. And I envisioned it as, 50, 60 page book, large print, maybe some nice, lithographs in it. And I went and I actually read Exodus for the first time, Confessions. I knew the story like you from Sunday school, but I'd never really looked at it in the Bible. And I read a couple of different translations. And as I read it, it just seemed to fit better and better into the thesis for my book, which is that the story of Exodus, the story of the Hebrews leaving bondage in Egypt, led by Moses toward the promised land, is actually a very profound metaphor, or parable, as I call it in the book, for our spiritual journey back to God. And of course, since that is what the Course is designed to help us do, is, make that journey without distance. The Course was instrumental to the underpinnings of my book, From Plagues to Miracles. That said, though, I did not want to do a book that was just chapter and verse of Course in Miracles. I'm really hoping to reach a much wider audience. Exodus is well known, and I'm hoping to show that even in Old Testament Bible stories, which most people really don't see any spiritual value in. I mean, the Old Testament God.
This guy.
Maybe change. The Old Testament God does not come off like a any of us would want to
nice
walk around with, much less connect to.
Wouldn't hang out with him.
I argue in the book, and I think that the Course would validate this, is that we project, our ego projects its own fears and attack thoughts onto God. And when you look at it that way, the Old Testament God is a very nice rendition of how the ego sees God. Oh, no, leave me alone, please. Just let me live my life, God. I'll pray to you when I need you, but otherwise, just back off, give me some space. The interesting thing about the Exodus story, though, is that Moses' relationship to God is very different than that of the Hebrews. Moses encounters the burning bush and the voice of the angel that then becomes God or leads into God. And, he isn't afraid. He doesn't run away. He doesn't turn away. In fact, he gets curious. He approaches and starts a dialogue with God that actually is the basis for the entire Exodus journey. Moses has been living in exile, and I think that has profound implications for our spiritual journey. And when he encounters God, he realizes, no, I have a purpose. I can't just, raise my father-in-law's flocks and, father children and, lead a normal mundane life. And he goes back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. So I guess, the elevator pitch for my book would be, imagine that this isn't really about people or history, but that it is a parable on a grand scale where the character of Pharaoh represents the ego mind, and the character of Moses represents, in Course terminology, I think it would be both Holy Spirit and the Christ. Because we are Moses, we are connected to God in that way, and yet Moses is also the intermediary, the vehicle through which we're brought toward God and the promised land. So that's kind of the book in a nutshell.
I very much enjoyed the book. You sent it to me before we had this interview, and what I really appreciated is you've got tremendous background as a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and it was fascinating to me how you weaved everything into this story of Exodus. I could really see your experience coming through, and you give a lot of examples of patients who you've dealt with, and you relate to real life stories,
Yes.
weaving in with these themes of Exodus, which, by the way, I mean, to me, it's very much a story about faith, isn't it? It's about believing in spirit and working, and believing that things will work out well, and then we always doubt, like the Hebrews did.
Yes. Well,
But things come through for us, yeah.
it shows us just how deeply ingrained our identification with the ego is.
Mm.
And, certainly for myself, and I don't know that I can speak for anyone else, the more I walk my spiritual path, the more astounded I am at what I uncover, in terms of, these. It's almost like weeding a garden, and you think you've got that, weed out, and, but that root goes deeper than you think.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I think in Exodus, well, jumping a little bit around here, most people think of Exodus as the crossing of the Red Sea, that's the penultimate miracle. I argue, no, that's actually the crossing over where we recognize that the ego is not us and that we have to leave it behind, but that the real work happens in the wilderness phase of the journey, and that the Hebrew people in Exodus have a real hard time with that. They just aren't able to trust that God is going to provide for them through manna and through the water that comes from a rock. Mm-hmm. But I see those as symbolic of, what I would call the generic form of the miracle. Whatever we need, Spirit will provide it. Holy Spirit will bring it to us. Mm. But we have to root out the habits of ego, which want to keep bringing us back to bondage in Egypt. So you have the Hebrews, they've crossed the Red Sea, they've had these amazing miracles, and they're sitting around dreaming about how great it was in Egypt. Mm. I think any of us on the spiritual path, we can have those great experiences, and then we go back to thinking about, oh, but I wish I had a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a little more money, I need that vacation. So we really fall into the same traps and pitfalls.
Mm. Mm. And back to the examples, as you being a psychologist, yes. The other thing which I think you tried to do, and I think you did really well, is portray such a broad spectrum of people, and people with daily problems in their lives, and when I read it, like we had a conversation before, I immediately identified with one of the stories which you were talking about with hoarding.
Yes.
I grew up in a family that did have that problem, and I was like, wow, that's my story, and I dealt with it. I mean, it was very personal. I mean,
that's powerful.
It's who I am, and made up for who I am and how I developed as an individual, and certainly in your book, there is something for everybody.
Yeah, one of the things as a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist that I come to is that, as we unwind ego along the spiritual path, some of the work is catalyzed purely by spirit and spiritual experiences. But it doesn't take much to look around and see that there are people who've had very high spiritual experiences whose lives are a disaster. Mm. They haven't done the work to, as I say, unravel the ego mind. And so it keeps popping up, like some nasty little pop-up on your computer that you can't get rid of, affecting you, interfering. So as a therapist, I think, the Exodus journey, the spiritual journey, is about transformation. Transformation from a limited body-based, ego-based sense of who we are in a physical world that seems real, to the recognition that we are spirit, that is our identity. But in making that transformation, we can transform in one arena of our lives that's very, very real, even though we're not doing it across the board. So, for example, I tell, as you say, I tell a lot of stories to illustrate the points. Without it, I think Exodus would be very dry, and I was not going to write a dry book. But there's a story about a man who just had to leave his job as a university administrator. It just got so toxic to him, and his trials and tribulations with money, with his sense of identity around that. There's another with, a man, a small-time real estate developer who, found himself in a horrific lawsuit that seemed like there was no way out, that reactivated his deepest core survival fears in ways that he'd never even known. I tell the story of a woman who wound up in a relationship with a married man, even though it was the last thing she wanted to do, and her difficulty in breaking free of that bondage, and the results when she finally did. So yeah, I'm trying to find ways in which, all of these different areas that bind us are open to transformation. And I think that's what psychotherapy does, and that's why I felt, really truly honored to be able to serve the people I work with and be a part of their journeys, and both, help catalyze and witness those transformations.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing like a real life story, isn't it? I mean, it's like, that there's a saying that the truth is always stranger than fiction.
Absolutely.
You read the story and it's like, oh my God, it's like, I don't believe that happened, but it did. It's a real story.
I'll tell you, Ken, as a screenwriter, there are things from real life that I would have loved to put in movies, and everyone would have gone, "Oh, no way! It's truth is stranger than fiction for sure."
I hear you. So, what was it? Did you decide to go into psychology and psychiatry when you were at in your 20s? And was there a heavy interest for you? Writing and psychotherapy were probably sort of the twin interests that I had from a very early point in college. I wanted to be a writer, and again, back to that formative time. My sophomore year, I took a course called Daily Themes. I attended Yale, and this was a course that had been around for, I don't know, probably close to 100 years, and all of these phenomenal name writers had taken it. It required, a short thumbnail sketch essay a day, and it just brought me to my knees. I mean, I was spending 3 hours obsessing on trying to crank out something perfect. So I really had to let it go. And when I did, I knew it wasn't forever. It was sort of one of those spiritual understandings of, okay, I'm not ready for this. And the way I related it to people is I decided, all right, if I can't write narratives, at least I can edit, and I can help edit the narratives that other people bring me in their lives, and help them get to a better place. So I actually did enter medical school knowing I wanted to go into psychiatry. My medical school advisor, when I wrote my essay, which was all about why I want to be a psychiatrist, read it thoughtfully and nodded and said, "This is very good. This is very good. I only have one criticism. You need to get rid of the psychiatry stuff." Whoa! So I just changed to why I want to be a doctor. And the funny thing is, later in life, producers would do the same thing. "This is really good. I really like this sensitive psychological piece you wrote, but somebody needs to murder someone." So I'm used to that kind of bait and switch. That's really fascinating. I mean, when did you make that transition from being a writer to being a professional psychiatrist? Or the other way around? I would say
roots, go to sophomore year when I just couldn't do the writing, and I kept it around. I mean, in medical school, I wrote a short piece for a medical student contest that won an honorable mention, and but at a certain point, I really did put the writing away. I mean, when I entered my psychiatry residency, that was it. That was my passion. I loved it. I loved all the different theories. I loved working with people. And actually, at that point, the course took very much of a backseat. I'd been a very avid student of the course, participating in groups, really from when I was introduced to it over the Christmas '75, probably right up until about '81, '82. Then I met my first wife. She was not into A Course in Miracles at all, although she was spiritually oriented. Medical school just came on like gangbusters. My residency came on like gangbusters. Actually both. And when I had to sort of devote my energy to this world, Um, but I think, the writing was always there in the background. And I don't think I could have written this book if I hadn't gone through, writing fiction and science fiction and screenplays, because I think it allowed me to tell those stories of my patients, and my own story much better.
So this is your first book?
My first nonfiction book.
Your first nonfiction book.
And my first published book.
Lovely.
Yeah, I wrote a novel about a group of arcane masters who sort of patrol the astral plane, dealing with all kinds of fun stuff that got a real serious look from HarperCollins back in the mid-'90s, but the book wasn't ready. I actually went and rewrote the whole thing a couple years ago. I just wasn't that good a writer then. So I think Spirit, knew what it was doing and helped me develop my writing skills before turning me back to this theme, the Passover Exodus theme that had been in my life, from the same point as the Course.
Yes. And, back to your book, again, the other weaving that you did was your own story, as you mentioned. And as you were growing up, I know that you grew up among, Judy was practically a godmother to you, and Bill was very much Bill Thetford was very much a mentor to you. Right,
from that point where I got the Course, absolutely.
And I love the stories, the synchronicities of Judy buying cider, and it's just
story, wonderful story. I think sometimes the best miracle stories, quote unquote, are the ones that seem very little. They don't have to be the Red Sea parting. It can just be, cider turning up and bringing you into a loving relationship with with a brother.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to say about the book, I have so many things to say about this book, but it's bringing up different themes, and I'm seeing different themes in how your journey and kind of like your angle is that you bring up different traditions.
Yes.
You quote Buddhism, you quote Eckhart Tolle, Adyashanti, and I know you're into the Abraham Hicks material, and I love that you started with the Seth material, because I'm just getting into the Seth material.
Seth is wonderful.
So I just love that diversity that you bring out, and it's kind of like, we were talking before, and we were saying how some course students are like, we are pure course, we don't want to talk about anything other than the course. But I feel, that's this is my angle as well. It's very unnatural, we're not appreciating that the different ways that people come to the course, and certainly there are different approaches for different things. There are many tools in people's toolkits.
Yes.
And we have to very often honor things in society which allow us to explain, course concepts more easily, because there is no such thing as, A Course in Miracles. At the end of the day, A Course in Miracles is just the form. What's important is the content behind it, isn't it?
It's just one path, and the Course says that itself. It says that there are many paths, although it does say, if you're reading this is likely your path. But I think we live in a rare and truly amazing period of time where there's so many avenues available for transformation. Walk into any New Age bookstore, and if there are any that still exist with Amazon and Barnes and Noble dominating.
They are. One or two.
Yeah, right. I think there's one in LA. I know there's one. Not around here. You walk into any one, and you've got more arcane knowledge and esoteric wisdom available to you than any person at any time frame on the history of the planet has had. So I think your point is outstanding. Whatever brings us to a greater sense of inner peace, whatever helps us see that we are more than a physical body, and that by identifying with the body, we essentially consign ourselves to bondage and suffering, to the Buddha's first noble truth, dukkha, all life is suffering. Anything that moves us in that direction is doing what it's supposed to do, and it doesn't have to be pristine, only A Course in Miracles. I think Jesus would be the last one to tell you that. And so we have all these riches, and I feel like if it's a smorgasbord, and if you want to sample a number of different dishes, that's fine. I do think at some point one of those usually rises and becomes your path. Just as it's a good idea to date a lot of people before you finally settle down and live with anyone. And you can live with someone and change your mind later too.
You're speaking from experience here, I take it.
Yes. And it's all good.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, my analogy would be, if you want to get from A to B, there are many ways to get there. But if you keep changing the mode of transport, if you keep changing cars or whatever, you're never going to get anywhere. So, yeah, I mean, I do appreciate that we live in a very diverse time where there's so many different spiritual paths. But at the end of the day, it's about practice. It's actually about moving. Are you actually driving your car towards the destination? Are you forgiving? Are you really practicing these principles which these spiritual paths teach?
Yeah, I mean, it only happens in our lives. That was one of the things that I very much appreciated about the Adyashanti story that I shared in the book. Adyashanti makes the point, and he makes it in a number of his books, that the real work is done in our lives. You can sit in meditation all you want. You can have mystical experiences out the wazoo. They're all, it's good stuff. It's important. But until you can bring it back and integrate it and see the work of day-to-day life as as sort of the substrate, the food of our transformation, it remains somewhat empty and abstract and at a distance.
Yes.
And to bring it back to the Course, one of the reasons that I really admire Bill Thetford as a mentor and is, he was 100% devoted to doing that. I think A Course in Miracles was a real surprise to him in some ways, although I know at a deeper level he knew exactly what he was doing. And, if you read the stories in Journey Without Distance, clearly Helen and Bill had been prepped for this for lifetimes. But I think he wasn't content just to bring it through and then go on the lecture circuit and, make that the rest of his life. He wanted to do the work internally and did. At the point of his death, as Carol Howe relates in Never Forget to Laugh, I believe interviewed her too, right? He had gotten there. He was at peace. He had forgiven everyone in his life. And therefore, I think really didn't have any more reason to stick around.
Yeah, it is an amazing story. I mean, Never Forget to Laugh was a very good book. And yeah, we were talking about, I mean, it's fascinating. When I read that book, it was fascinating to hear that, they had all these psychic readings and, supposedly Bill and Helen had previous lifetimes in Egypt. I was like, wow, I never knew they went to this kind of thing, which I love. But, it's a side story and, obviously it's all an illusion.
Yes.
Let's talk about the foundation for inner peace. And, like we were again talking earlier before the interview, a lot of course students don't know what the foundation for inner peace is, and neither do they know the work of Ken Wapnick or the Foundation for A Course in Miracles. Now you sit on the board of Foundation for Inner Peace.
Yes.
So to tell us, what is the Foundation for Inner Peace and what is their function?
Well, let me, to understand it, we need to go to a little bit of history. Sure. When Judy came upon the Course, she was running something called the Foundation for Parapsychological Research. She was very active in parapsychology. She'd been involved with Uri Geller, Russ Targ, who did the remote viewing experiments out at Stanford. Baba Muktananda had stayed at her condo in New York.
Amazing.
So she had, a good strong base in spirituality. But once she got the Course, she knew that was her path. And I don't presume to speak for Judy. This is all pretty much, again, in Journey Without Distance. And so she changed the Foundation for Parapsychological Research to the Foundation for Inner Peace. I believe the name came from Helen and from Jesus. But the idea was that rather than turning the Course over to some publisher, that the Foundation was the steward to get the Course published and over time to shepherd its translation into as many languages and disseminate it as widely as possible across the globe. And I think that, Judy and Bob Scutch, her husband then, and Bill Whitson, her husband now, all of whom, are close and get along wonderfully well, have done a phenomenal job at that. So the foundation had its origins back then. The first edition of the course, I think it was 5,000, hardbound copies. I actually, I have a copy of each iteration down
Wow.
in my room.
Let's see.
At some time, yeah. But
amazing.
It was published through miracles. I mean, a gentleman, a transsexual living in Mexico provided the funds for the first, the first publication. So this was very much okay. We're listening to Spirit and we're doing the best we can. Helen was insistent that it be copyrighted. Jesus wants it copyrighted, which I think is an interesting story in its own right, since the copyright was lost in court. I don't remember when exactly, probably about 5 years ago. But my take on that is that it needed to be in a lockdown copyrighted form for 30 years so that it could get out there and be recognized for what it was, at which point you take away the copyright, because by now people have that solid foundation, and if it's going to drift, it'll drift. But
Yes.
I have to confess, I smile in wry amusement at some of the controversies and some of the things I hear about, the foundation and Ken Wapnick being the Pope or trying to control this or that. It's all out there. I mean, if you want to read the urtext, it's there. As a writer, I can't imagine that urtext ever getting published. I mean, it was just full of all kinds of ramblings and personal statements. So I'm very pleased that, Ken and Judy and Bill and Helen put the time and energy in to turn it into what it is today. But if you want to see its origins, it's there. There's no evil cabal involved trying to keep the truth from people.
Yeah.
But for me, it's kind of interesting, because if you study the early history of Christianity, and read, say, Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels, and see how the early church fathers cherry-picked what would be part of the official canon of Christianity and what would be rejected as, heretical, you suddenly see how easy that is to have happened, because we're already, within the course community itself, there are these little fissures and fractures taking place.
Yeah.
But so the purpose of the Foundation for Inner Peace was to shepherd the publication of the course and to oversee the translations. At a certain point, and again, I don't remember the exact date, but I'm guessing this was probably late 80s, early 90s, Ken's Foundation for A Course in Miracles took over all teaching functions. And so the Foundation for A Course in Miracles was, as Judy puts it, the teaching arm of the Foundation for Inner Peace, sister organizations. But, whatever people think of Ken, I don't think it's possible to contest that he is the most knowledgeable person on the planet regarding the course, and his website has more access to more questions, answers, explanations. I mean, my God, the guy is insanely prolific.
Yeah, 1,400 questions. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, is there anything that hasn't been asked before?
Yeah, so, what I would say to people is, if that serves your path, use it. It's there, it's good stuff. But if for some reason the tone or the idiom doesn't work for you, then, go directly to the course or take a different path. But notice whether you're being brought toward truth or not.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, yeah. Obviously I've been through all of that controversy and different editions myself. And I think at the end of the day, it's what you're guided to. I think certain people will stick to controversy. They will they will be in that space because they want to be in that space. I have personally never been really drawn towards any other edition of the course other than the ones published by the Foundation for Inner Peace. And
So,
yeah, I mean, I think there's great wisdom in in wanting. Now, at first, obviously, it seems very odd to want to copyright and to have kind of control over a spiritual text, certainly something that came from Jesus, I mean, supposedly. But at the same time, I mean, we look, like you were saying, what happened in history. I mean, there was so much distortion that went on. I mean, if the Bible was copyrighted when it came out, we probably wouldn't have so many problems as we did.
Absolutely. And if you look at the work of people like, what's his name? There's a professor, Ekman, I think his name is, who's Bart Erdman. Who looks at how things were added to the New Testament, or, even the Jefferson Bible, where Thomas Jefferson said it's so clear going through the New Testament what actually comes from Jesus and what was added in by the church, because the tone is completely different. They feel completely different. So It's totally makes sense to me that Jesus dictating this would want to, one, avoid the cult of personality, by channeling it to two very reticent private, Columbia psychology professors, and two, would want it copyrighted in order to avoid all of that. But as I said, at a certain point, children need rules to follow, as I point out in my book. But at a certain point where we are supposed to reach spiritual maturity, I think these choices are laid out for us so that we can choose once again. And indeed, if someone is drawn to that text, if they identify with Bill and Helen, in their struggles, certainly, for example, the beginning of the text has a lot on sexuality that I know Bill and Helen must have been extremely embarrassed about, and were never put in the final version of the course. But it's there if you're interested. So yeah, the copyright makes sense, and I can justify the loss of the copyright. And to your point, Ken, at the beginning of the classification of terms, I believe it says a universal theology is impossible. A universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. So yes, to your point, it's not about who said what, or how many angels dance on the head of the pin, or is this sentence rendered right in the Foundation version or in the Hewlin Casey version. It's, is this guiding you towards an experience of oneness with the sonship? Yeah.
And I mean, what really made it, what was a real good point for me was that Helen's channeling was I mean, it wasn't like she was crystal clear and then suddenly, it all came fluently. I mean, like Ken Wapnick, I mean, he says the form of the course is Helen. I mean, it's not like Jesus wrote it word for word. I mean, she actually, put it in her own words. And suddenly there was a lot of, in regards to sex, I mean, Helen was into Bill, and Bill was gay, and I mean, there were a lot of different sexual issues which obviously colored what Jesus wanted to transmit, and I'm sure a lot of it wasn't what Jesus wanted to say to the general public. It was very specific towards Helen and Bill and their specific situations, plus the overlay of their mind coming into that picture. So
yeah, absolutely. And in fact, if you read the text, I mean, as a psychiatrist who's just old enough to have been at the very end of the psychoanalytic era, I mean, there are words and references in there that I suspect 99.9% of people reading them would have no idea what they're talking about, because they're relating to psychoanalytic, metapsychology. And yes, Jesus was speaking to them in the terms that they understood. And any relationship with channeled work. I mean, if you read the earliest Seth, I think it was the Seth material that came first. If you listen to Esther Hicks's, first channeled Abraham works, they tend to be pretty thin gruel. There's not much there. There are a lot of hesitations. The reception has to be fine tuned. And in reading the course, it's so clear that happened. I mean, why is there no text for the workbook? Because the workbook is beautiful and it was fluent and mellifluous by the time they got there. She and Jesus could do that dance.
Well, Bob, that leads us on to another topic which I love to talk about, and that's psychology. And certainly psychology and A Course in Miracles go hand in hand, like peanut butter and jelly, I guess. And I mean, there's been so many psychologists and psychiatrists involved with this work, and certainly, I mean, I'm happy to be able to speak to you about it because I mean, you're a bona fide psychiatrist, and psychiatry is obviously different from psychology, you know, because you've done a lot more training with the medical side of things.
Right. We train medically, and you know, at least in the U.S., we're allowed to prescribe medications, which I think initially was a boon, and at this point is probably a liability because most psychiatrists only think in terms of medications and psychopharmacology these days, and I think that's a shame. But yeah, let's talk about psychology.
Yeah, I mean, from a very let's talk about big overview here, and bearing in mind we a lot of course students are here are kind of there's a broad spectrum of new and old students. Let's talk about broad psychological themes in the course. I mean, why, as a psychologist looking at the Course in Miracles, what are the very strong psychological themes that stand out?
Boy. You're asking me to sort of, you know, summarize War and Peace in 2 sentences here.
That's what I do.
Let me take it in a slightly different direction.
Sure.
Psychology is the study of the mind, how it works, what it does, why we need it. And the idea of the ego, you know, dates back to Sigmund Freud, who actually, I mean, in the original German, it was das Ich, which means the I. So, you know, part of what happened when Freud's work got brought to the United States is that they scientized it. They gave words that in the German had very common everyday meanings and understandings, and turned them into complicated words like ego and id and cathexis and but so the ego is the I. That's how Freud conceptualized it. So all psychology at some level is an attempt to answer the question, who am I, or what am I? And I think that applies both at a personal individual level, you know, who is Bob Rosenthal, you know, who is Ken Bach, what are our particular preferences and tastes, what are the experiences from our past that shaped us, what turned us into who we are today, what makes us mad, what makes us sad, what makes us feel happy, what makes us feel shame. But at a broader level, psychology is what makes the human mind tick. So you wind up with all of these different theories about how the ego is formed. I offer my own in my book. I wouldn't claim that it's right or truth, capital T. I think it's a good approximation, and it's what my thinking as a psychiatrist and as a spiritual seeker has led me to. But back to my old professor, Theodore Gaster, Gaster made, I think, the very astute observation that the difference between Western religion and Eastern religion is that Western religions attempt to answer the question, what is the world? So notice, what is the world is not psychology. What is the world immediately focuses us out there, tries to figure out our place in the world. Are we good? Are we bad?
You've already assumed that the world exists.
And we absolutely, that is never called into question. The world is a reality. Whereas he said Eastern religions attempt to answer the question, what am I? What is the self? So in that sense, Eastern religions aren't really religions in the sense that we understand it in the West, at least not if they're practiced truly. I mean, the Buddha, wrote extensively about what is the self, and what I think he got to was an understanding that Western psychology has not gotten to yet, but that the Course absolutely is there on, which is ego, the ego mind, is a fundamentally unsound, inherently unstable structure that no matter how much we work it, bend it, no matter how strong a quote-unquote ego we have, we're not going to find true, lasting, abiding happiness. We're not going to find true, lasting inner peace because we're looking in the wrong place. You know, the drunk looking for his keys under the light because, gee, well, that's where we think we can see when, you know, that's not where the keys are. So Western psychology is an attempt to answer these questions. I think a very noble attempt. I think it adds a lot to the dialogue. Certainly in working with, my patients, I'm not throwing Course in Miracles at them, almost never. I use the Course to center myself and remind myself that I'm not special, that I'm not entering into this holy relationship from a place of I know better and they don't. I maybe have traveled a little further on my path, but they're on the same path whether they know it or not. So I use the Course in that way, but the principles of psychology I think are very, very helpful in allowing us to, again, transform and unwind those areas of ego that we're not able to surmount from a spiritual perspective. I think there are very, very few people who can just leave it all behind and, go off and, follow Jesus. I do believe there are some, and boy, I admire them. There's a section in the Course, in the teacher's manual, Are Changes Required in the Lives of God's Teachers? And I used to read that thinking, it said, sometimes dramatic changes are required. And I was like, please, not me. I want the incremental, stepwise changes.
Sure.
And I think for the majority of people, those work better. Big changes for most people scare us. And when we're scared, we go running back into the arms of the ego.
Yeah. I think Spirit's way is always very gentle.
Yes. There's another line in the Course, do not fear, you will not be hurled into reality. Again, I take solace from that.
Tell us. Sorry?
I was going to say, we're only given as much as we can take in at any given point.
Absolutely. I think Spirit's plan is always very optimized. To me, it's like he's the great optimizer in the sky. he arranges everything in the perfect way.
We know ourselves. Yes.
Back to psychology, because I'm fascinated by this topic. I love talking to people who actually know what they're talking about. And let's talk about projection and denial, and then projection. What is that?
Denial is probably the most core ego defense that our minds are capable of. Denial is basically a defense mechanism that says, this is happening to me, but I don't believe it. I don't want to look at it. No, it won't do it. I actually had a vignette in my book that I shared and then took out because it seemed like it was just a little too petty compared with some of the other examples. But when I was living in New York at Judy's apartment that summer, I had my car in the city, and New York, on the Upper West Side anyway, has alternate side of the street parking, which means that every day you have to get out there and move your car from one side
heard about this before,
to the other. Or they will tow it, and they tow it to some dock on the Hudson River with 100,000 cars there, and you're wandering the wilderness trying to find your car.
Lovely.
And then paying a lot of money to get it back.
Very nice.
So one day I went to get my car to move it, and I'm looking up and down the street, and my car's not there. Okay, I must have parked it on somewhere else. I walked up and down twice, couldn't find it. Went to the next street over, couldn't find it there. Walked back to the next street on the other side, not there. No, my car's here somewhere. That's denial. In reality, my car had either been stolen or towed, and in fact, it had been towed. So that's how I know what happens when your car is towed in New York.
Sure.
Other examples, I worked in what's called consult liaison psychiatry, which is where it's a consultation service in medical hospitals where psychiatrists go in and work with medically ill people. Darlene's story in the Golden Calf chapter in my book comes from my work in consult liaison psychiatry. So I remember once, it's funny, I don't remember whether this was I think this was a case we had, a woman who presented to the hospital with a stage 4 breast cancer. I mean, it had literally grown out of her breast. I mean, there was no way you could, anyone else in their right mind would have been to the doctor and to the surgeon, probably a year earlier, but she was in total denial about it. This can't be anything serious. It's not a problem. So we resort to denial when our survival feels threatened and we don't know what to do about it, or when, as I say in my book, when any aspect of ourself that we've identified with so strongly is threatened, that we react as if survival were on the line. So that if you're in love with someone and you discover that they're cheating on you, or they inform you that, they're done with the relationship, and you are so invested in that person that they have become part of yourself, you might go off and commit suicide. But so denial it's a very primitive defense mechanism. It's very black and white. As a result, it's not a terribly skillful one. It doesn't allow for a lot of work.
Sure.
In From Plagues to Miracles, we do see denial in the behavior of Pharaoh, the ego, during the 10 plagues. In the first several plagues, Pharaoh's magicians are able to duplicate the miracle, and in the book I go into this at some length and show how the magicians really are the agents of denial, even a pun on denial, the Nile River, which goes to 12-step work. But that Pharaoh doesn't realize that his world is unsustainable, that God and Moses are coming and saying, you need to let go. You need to let this portion of the mind go free and find its way back to God. But he's in denial. And even when he gives in, oh, please, take these locusts away. The moment they're gone, he's, back to, no, you can't go. That's denial.
And
I'm sorry, there was another piece you asked?
Exactly. So from my understanding, projection is very much interlinked with denial, because it's almost like you push it down. We compartmentalize things which we don't want to see. And then we don't only do that. We put it outside of us. We start pointing fingers and saying, he's the guilty one. It's not my stuff. It's his stuff. You go deal with your
projection is very fundamental. The course talks about it a lot. It was one of the tenets of psychoanalytic psychology. So projection is exactly what you described, Ken. Some quality in myself that I've disavowed and don't want to recognize, I see in someone else, and I react to it strongly, perhaps even viciously, in someone else. Give you an example, and I've got to dress this up a little bit. But when I was in my residency, one of my colleagues was had really done a lot of 12-step work, addictive work. He'd recognize addiction in patients on the inpatient units and make a very big production of getting them to AA and lining up people to drive them. And I really admired it. I mean, the guy had a ton of energy and, and really was a man on a mission. And then one day I was doing night call, and one of the mental health techs made some comment about, let's call him Joe, wow, well, Joe has the best pot I ever smoked. And I was, what? And oh yeah, when Joe's down here, we all get high. I mean, this was work. This is night call. We're dealing with disturbed patients coming in.
Right.
So you could argue that, that what Joe did was, take his issue, project it out on the world, and was healing everyone else without really dealing with, his own stuff. Projection, you see it everywhere. I mean, if you look at politics, projection is rampant. When people want to, destroy someone else, it's usually because they haven't come to terms with that in themselves. The people who are most angry, the people who fight the war on drugs, are alcoholics. The people who have problems with sexuality and birth control pills and see it everywhere are those who haven't come to terms with their own sexuality. If they had, they'd have compassion for for sex addicts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all that finger pointing, isn't it?
Yeah. So projection is everywhere. I actually think projection is more prevalent than denial, only because it seems to work better. But notice again, both defenses take us away from the problem. And so this is one of the issues of the defense mechanism that actually Bill Thetford was the first to point out to me. Every defense mechanism introduces a distortion in truth. If you're defending in any way, you've put a little wrinkle in there, and you're not willing or able to contend with truth coming through.
Interesting. Because I see. You've created that own I mean, essentially, you've built your own walls
Yes, you built your own walls.
to hide that truth from you.
In
That's very
my
interesting
book, I
concept.
use the humorous example. I think it was from Laurel and Hardy that I came, but I'm not sure, so I didn't give attribution in that way. Of two friends, and one standing on the street corner with a banana in his ear, and the other comes along and says, you know, Joe, what are you doing with the banana in your ear? And Joe says, well, it keeps the tigers away. And he's, but Joe, there are no tigers around here. Just, yeah, see, it works. And the idea there is once we use a defense mechanism, we put up that wall, so we're not even in tune with what's really out there, and therefore we can't do the inner growth work, whether through psychology or through spirituality, to come to terms with it. Let me give another example. I worked with someone who, as a child, the victim of a vicious dog attack. And developed a phobia around dogs. And so whenever a dog would get in her vicinity, she'd freak out, panic, run away. But what was interesting is that she couldn't discriminate between, say, a Great Dane charging at her with growling and frothing jaws, which hopefully would make any one of us turn and run, versus, that cute little beagle or terrier with his tail wagging coming up. It was a dog. It was scary. And by getting away, her defense mechanism prevented her from ever, in a sense, hanging in there with the situation so that she could learn to discern what was a safe, friendly dog from what wasn't. So again, here's the problem with defense mechanisms. They keep us from moving into our fear, and yet paradoxically in the process, they preserve that fear. We can't do any work on it while it's being protected that way.
Yeah, I see you. It's very irrational and it goes to extremes.
Yes, yes. So, the Course is the ultimate bringer of truth and light into the shadow world of defense mechanisms, and points out that all of our defense mechanisms, everything that the ego brings to us, its wishes, its hopes, its fears, whether it's, storing up on batteries and water in case the power goes out, or buying an arsenal of guns because those bad people from the city are going to come marching out to get that. All of these are doomed to backfire on us, and can't bring us real peace.
Yeah. Well, on that beautiful note, we're just coming up to an hour.
Okay.
Any last words you'd like to tell our viewers, listeners? When are we expecting your book?
The official release date is April 1st. I know it has already been shipped to stores. I will, this is
lovely.
Plagues and Miracles, the transformational journey of Exodus, from the slavery of ego to the promised land of spirit. And I think, by way of a wrap-up, what I would say is, all paths ultimately lead to the one path of the spiritual journey, whether we're aware of it or not. So if you're listening to this interview, you're already ahead of the game. You're on the spiritual path. Embrace that. Recognize that psychology does have something to offer, but that ultimately all psychology also flows into the spiritual path, as Buddhism, Hinduism, which I'm a little less familiar with, and certainly A Course in Miracles would all testify to. And what I've tried to show in From Plagues to Miracles is that even a work as seemingly non-spiritual as the Old Testament story of Exodus holds profound spiritual truth, and can serve as an amazing roadmap for our own spiritual journey if we read it properly.
Wonderful. Well, Bob, thank you so much for having this interview. It's been an amazing hour, and I've learned so much from this this first hour.
I enjoyed it too. Yeah, it's a pleasure talking to you.
So that was Bob Rosenthal. I'm going to put links to Bob's websites on the link below. So do click on the description page and check out more information. And Bob, what's your website?
It's FromPlaguesToMiracles.com. It is up and running. It doesn't have all of its content on it yet, but it does have excerpts from the book from most of the chapters. Tells a little bit about me. Events. I'll certainly, list this interview in the news and events section. So there's more coming, but yes, it is up.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks very much, Bob. So thanks for viewing, and hope you enjoyed and got something out of this little clip. I will speak to you guys soon. Bye for now.